Good morning and welcome. For decades, the post-Cold War global order has been largely defined by the economic, political, and military primacy of the United States. This unipolar moment shaped international institutions, trade routes, and security alliances. However, the foundational pillars of this order are now undergoing a profound and irreversible shift. We are witnessing not a temporary fluctuation, but a fundamental structural realignment towards a multipolar world. The central question we must address today is no longer if this transition is happening, but how the United States is responding to it, and what the consequences of that response will be for global stability and its own long-term standing. The prevailing narrative from Washington often projects unwavering strength and a restoration of dominance. Yet, a clear-eyed, data-driven analysis reveals a more complex and concerning picture. A superpower struggling to adapt, increasingly resorting to unilateral and confrontational tools to manage its relative decline. In this analysis, we will move beyond rhetoric to examine the hard evidence. We will chart the meteoric rise of alternative power centers, notably the expanded BRICS Plus bloc, which now commands a greater share of global GDP than the traditional G7. We will then dissect the strategic response from the United States, its trade wars, its inward turn, and its domestic political fractures, evaluating its efficacy not through ideology, but through the prism of tangible outcomes and long-term strategic interests. Our objective is to understand the dynamics of this great power transition and to assess whether current policies are mitigating or, paradoxically, accelerating the very decline they seek to prevent. The current geopolitical landscape, forging a multipolar world order. We cannot analyze the U.S. response without first understanding the nature of the new geopolitical environment in which it is operating. The 21st century is witnessing the end of the brief unipolar moment and the rapid rise of a constellation of new power centers, each pursuing its own strategic interests and challenging the long-dominant Western institutions. The recent convergence of leaders from China, Russia, India, and other BRICS nations in Beijing was not merely a routine diplomatic conference. It was a deliberate strategic statement, a clear signal that these powers are proactively and systematically building parallel governance and economic architectures to minimize their dependence on the West. The primary driver behind this shift is not pure ideology, but a pragmatic calculus of risk and opportunity. Events like the 2008 global financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and, crucially, the increasingly frequent use of Western financial sanctions, with the US dollar as the key tool, have taught these nations a stark lesson. Over-reliance on the Western system is a strategic vulnerability. Consequently, they are no longer seeking to passively integrate into the existing order, but are actively constructing alternatives. We can observe this phenomenon across three main dimensions. Independent financial systems. A critical effort is the development of cross-border payment mechanisms to bypass the Western-dominated SWIFT system. Initiatives like China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, and the push for settlements in national currencies for bilateral trade are gradually creating an alternative financial network. The long-term goal is not the immediate elimination of the dollar, but the creation of a buffering system to minimize vulnerability to U.S. coercive measures. Reorienting supply chains and trade. These nations no longer view the West as their exclusive export market. Instead, they are focusing on bolstering intra-bloc trade and commerce with other developing regions. Regional trade agreements and massive infrastructure investments through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, aim to create new trade routes and economic hubs fundamentally independent of Western influence. Diversifying strategic alliances. The expanded BRICS Plus is a testament to this trend. It is not a tight military alliance like NATO, but a flexible multilateral platform focused on economic cooperation and political dialogue. It allows members with diverse foreign relations to collectively advocate for a multipolar world order where they have a greater voice. In summary, the current geopolitical landscape is characterized by a process of power deconcentration. These nations are not necessarily seeking direct military confrontation with the United States. Rather, they are building a parallel global structure where their influence and prosperity are no longer dictated by decisions from Washington or Brussels. This is the new environment, complex, competitive, and multi-centered that the United States must confront. Washington's response to this emerging reality will be the subject of the next part of our analysis. Objective data and trends, quantifying the economic rebalancing. To move beyond theoretical assertions and fully grasp the scale of this geopolitical shift, we must turn to objective, quantifiable data. The numbers reveal a story of profound economic rebalancing that forms the material foundation of the new multipolar order. This is not a future prediction. It is a present-day reality, measurable in economic weight, demographic power, and strategic investment. The most telling metric is the comparison of economic scale. When measured by purchasing power parity, PPP, which adjusts for cost of living and provides a better measure of the real volume of goods and services an economy produces, the expanded BRICS Plus bloc now accounts for over 35% of global GDP. In contrast, the traditional G7 nations account for approximately 30%. This crossover is a historic inflection point, symbolizing that the economic center of gravity has decisively shifted away from the transatlantic core. While the United States remains the world's largest single economy, its relative weight is diminishing within a much larger and more diverse global pool. Beyond aggregate output, demographic destiny plays a crucial role. The BRICS Plus nations are home to over 40% of the world's population. This represents an unparalleled demographic dividend, a vast, growing consumer market, a source of youthful labor, and an engine for innovation. China and India alone graduate millions more STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics students annually than the West. Meanwhile, the G7 nations collectively face the headwinds of aging populations, which strain public finances and potentially constrain long-term economic dynamism. This economic and demographic mass is being activated through unprecedented strategic infrastructure development. The speed and scale of building, from high-speed rail networks and smart cities to 5G grids and modern ports, in nations like China and India dwarf comparable efforts in many Western countries. This is not merely about domestic development. It is about building the connective tissue of 21st century commerce. Initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative create new trade corridors, deepen economic interdependence across Eurasia and the Global South, and fundamentally alter global logistics networks. This infrastructure advantage translates into long-term competitive gains in efficiency, supply chain resilience, and economic influence. Furthermore, this shift is structural and self-reinforcing. As these economies grow and their middle classes expand, they naturally trade more with each other, creating internal momentum that further reduces their external dependence. The drive for technological sovereignty, from semiconductor production to AI development, is accelerating this decoupling. Nations are increasingly prioritizing control over their critical technological supply chains, a trend exacerbated by U.S. export controls, which have had the unintended consequence of spurring innovation and import substitution abroad. In conclusion, the data paints an unambiguous picture. The international system is undergoing a fundamental rebalancing of economic power. The dominance of the G7 is a relic of the 20th century. The rise of the BRICS Plus is the defining economic story of the 21st. This shift is powered by overwhelming demographic weight, strategic long-term investment in future-facing infrastructure, and a deliberate policy of reducing vulnerability to Western-dominated systems. This new reality forms the inescapable context for any analysis of U.S. foreign policy. Ignoring or denying these structural trends is not a strategy. It is a pathway to strategic irrelevance. The critical question, therefore, is how the United States is choosing to respond to this new world, a subject we will delve into next. Analyzing the U.S. strategic response, confrontation over adaptation. The rise of a multipolar world presents any established power with a fundamental choice: adapt to the new reality and seek to shape it through engagement and renewed competitiveness, or resist it through confrontation and attempts to reassert eroding dominance. Based on observable policy actions, the current U.S. strategic response appears firmly rooted in the latter camp, an approach characterized by unilateralism, economic coercion, and a troubling inward focus that risks accelerating the very decline it aims to prevent. The cornerstone of this response has been an aggressive use of trade and tariff policy. Framed as rectifying unfair practices and protecting national security, the widespread imposition of tariffs is, in strategic terms, a primarily defensive and punitive tool. While it may offer short-term political resonance domestically, its long-term strategic effects are likely counterproductive. By increasing costs for American consumers and businesses and disrupting established supply chains, these policies act as attacks on the U.S. economy. More critically, they serve as a powerful catalyst for the very phenomenon they aim to stop: de-risking and decoupling. Nations and corporations worldwide, faced with the weaponization of trade, are incentivized to accelerate their search for alternative suppliers, markets, and financial systems less vulnerable to U.S. pressure. This doesn't halt the rise of other powers. It merely encourages them to build parallel structures that exclude the United States. This external posture is mirrored by a domestic political narrative that seeks external scapegoats for complex internal challenges. The profound economic dislocations caused by deindustrialization, automation, and inequality are often simplified and redirected toward immigrants and unfair foreign competition. While politically expedient in the short term, this narrative is strategically myopic. It diverts national energy away from the arduous task of domestic renewal, investing in education, infrastructure, and industrial policy to enhance competitiveness, and instead fosters a politics of resentment and blame. A nation focused on blaming others is not focusing on fixing itself. This internal division weakens the social cohesion and political consensus necessary to navigate a period of intense global competition. Perhaps the most paradoxical and significant trend is the move toward a closer merger of state and corporate power, often framed as necessary for great power competition. This is evident in policies like expansive industrial subsidies, coercive technology transfer demands on private companies, and even the government taking equity stakes in key strategic corporations. While justified under the banner of national security, this shift blurs the line between market-driven capitalism and state-directed capitalism, the very model the U.S. claims to oppose. This approach risks undermining the innovative, dynamic private sector that has long been a source of American strength, replacing it with a system where investment decisions are increasingly influenced by political directives rather than market signals. In essence, the U.S. response has been to employ the tools of a bygone unipolar era to confront the reality of a multipolar one. The reliance on coercive economic measures, scapegoating, and state intervention suggests a power attempting to assert control through dominance rather than adapt through innovation and diplomacy. This strategy may yield temporary tactical wins, but it strategically alienates partners, accelerates the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, and fails to address the underlying domestic weaknesses that are the true source of American anxiety. Instead of forging a coalition to manage multipolarity, this response risks leaving the United States more isolated, forcing the world to learn to operate without it. Future scenarios, pathways for a multipolar world. The current trajectory of U.S. policy, prioritizing confrontation over adaptation, does not occur in a vacuum. It initiates a complex feedback loop with other global powers, shaping a range of possible futures. Based on the analysis thus far, we can extrapolate 3 plausible scenarios for how the next decade may unfold. These are not certainties, but potential pathways defined by the interplay of current trends and critical choices yet to be made. The conflictual decoupling scenario. In this trajectory, the current trends intensify. The U.S. continues to rely on sanctions, tariffs, and technological containment, met with accelerated countermeasures by China and its partners. The world economy decisively splits into 2 competing and increasingly insulated technological and trade blocs, one U.S.-centric and the other centered on China and the global South. This bifurcation leads to significant inefficiencies, duplicated supply chains, and higher costs globally. Innovation slows as collaborative scientific research is stifled. The risk of miscalculation and direct conflict, while still low, rises considerably as economic competition spills over into military posturing and flashpoints like the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. Global governance institutions like the WTO and IMF become irrelevant, replaced by competing regional frameworks. This is a future of entrenched rivalry and diminished prosperity for all. The pragmatic adaptation scenario. After a period of costly friction, a recalibration occurs. A future U.S. administration, perhaps facing domestic economic pressure from prolonged trade conflicts, shifts towards a strategy of managed competition. This involves accepting multipolarity as an irreversible reality and focusing on rebuilding America's competitive edge through domestic investment in R&D, education, and infrastructure, rather than through external coercion. Tactical de-risking continues, but not wholesale decoupling. The U.S. re-engages with allies to set new, inclusive rules of the road for critical issues like digital governance, AI ethics, and climate change, recognizing that some challenges are transnational and require cooperation with rivals. This scenario leads to a stable, if competitive, coexistence where economic interdependence is carefully managed rather than severed. The accelerated isolation scenario. This is the darkest outcome for U.S. influence. The current policy of unilateralism and confrontation backfires spectacularly. It accelerates the formation of a cohesive non-Western economic bloc united not by ideology, but by a shared desire to escape U.S. financial and technological hegemony. The U.S. dollar's role as the global reserve currency erodes faster than anticipated. Allies, weary of volatile U.S. policy and enticed by the markets of the East, increasingly hedge their bets, pursuing their own bilateral agreements with Beijing and others. The United States, having alienated both rivals and partners, finds itself increasingly isolated, its ability to project power and shape global outcomes severely diminished. It remains a powerful nation but becomes a less relevant one, a victim of its own failure to devise a sustainable strategy for a world it can no longer dominate. Conclusion: the imperative for strategic realism. The defining challenge for the United States is not an external threat, but an internal one: the need for strategic realism. This requires a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the unipolar moment is over and that the tools of dominance are ineffective against the structural shift of economic and political power to a multipolar order. Prolonged denial and the pursuit of restoration through force are a recipe for the accelerated isolation or conflictual decoupling scenarios. The more sustainable, though challenging, path lies in pragmatic adaptation. This would entail a foreign policy that combines unwavering defense of core national interests with a sophisticated diplomacy capable of engaging both allies and adversaries in rulemaking. Crucially, it must be underpinned by a grand domestic project of national renewal, a concerted effort to enhance American competitiveness, innovation, and social resilience from within. The next decade will be determined by a simple choice. Will the United States attempt to wall itself off from a changing world, or will it muster the confidence and creativity to compete and cooperate within it? The answer will define its role in the 21st century.